All right. So, very excited today to be talking to one of my favorite people in the world, Suzanne Barchers. We work together at Leapfrog and we've remained in contact, and she's helping out quite a bit on Leonardo. And we'll get into all of that stuff later. But basically, Suzanne, welcome. Thank you for taking a few minutes. And let's just start kind of at the beginning of, where did you come from? How did you get into education? How did you get into ed tech and all that exciting stuff? I didn't meet you till much later, but I'm excited to hear all about how the origin story of Suzanne.
The origin story. Like many baby boomers who were women, I didn't have many options. So, being kind of smart and interested in music and lots of different things, I chose teacher over being a beautician or a nurse because I didn't want to empty bedpans and didn't think I would be a good beautician or secretary for that matter. And my mom was a teacher, my dad was a preacher in small, poor communities. So I gravitated toward that. We traveled, even though we didn't have much in the way of financial means. So I'd seen all of the continental United States by the time I went off to college. I started out as a music major, saw the error of my ways, switched to education, and married soon after college. And in that time and period, women could get teaching jobs pretty quickly and pretty easily. So during the Vietnam years and grad school years for my husband, I had a lot of teaching experience. Then I did the traditional thing, became a stay at home mom after getting my master's, and then started working on my doctorate with the goal of having that by the time I was 40. I actually made it just before I turned 39.
Woohoo!
And I started writing during that period. And thanks to a number of mentors, a lot of women who believed in me, I worked my way from teaching to publishing to working for Weekly Reader in Connecticut and finally writing for and then being hired by Leapfrog, which is where I got into the technology part of the business. And always been fascinated with how we can help kids move through learning challenges with ease. And I had two sons, one homemade and one adopted, and one learned to read very easily, one needed a basal reader with lots of practice and repetition. And for him, it reminded me as a teacher that you need a lot of tricks in your bag, and you need to be able to try different things and be willing to stop and look and think. And in thinking about my history with reading and reading teaching, I go right back to my student teacher days, which was in preschool, where we didn't so much direct the learning as we set up the learning experiences. We spent a lot of time observing, and we shaped the decisions about the program based on how we saw the children approach learning. This really came into play when I was teaching in Texas, and I was teaching a pull-out program called the MBI Kids, and that stood for minimally brain injured. If you can imagine saying, "Okay, I'm the MBI teacher," the minimally brain injured, which maybe there was some karma in that. But the observation is the point because I had seen all kinds of teaching techniques. I loved going to conferences, even in my early
Right.
days. I had been exposed to Jeanette Veach as a speaker, and she is the one who advocated more of the language experience approach coupled with visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile methods. So the story I want to tell, and then I'll throw it back to you, Chris, was about a little boy who came in during my MBI class. He had fallen out from a tree when he
Mm.
was about 9, and his left arm had a spasm, an involuntary spasm that he couldn't control. So it was very difficult for him to complete a worksheet or write on a piece of notebook paper because he couldn't hold the paper. And I watched him struggling, visited with him that night, kept thinking about what I'd watched. And I grabbed a very simple aid, a clipboard. I took it in the next day and I showed him how to use his left arm, even if it had a spasm, to push open that clip, slide a piece of paper in. And suddenly, this young man of about 9 or 10 was able to write to complete his assignments. And I don't know how many years he had been afflicted like this,
Right.
but all it took was at that time a $1 or $2 device that most of us have in our homes, and he gained independence.
Yeah. I mean, what an amazing story. And but it's so emblematic of what I know of you and what, the things that you've taught me and the way that you approach it. And it's not so much the $2 clipboard that anybody had. What he was really lucky to encounter was to encounter somebody who was thinking further into the problem and thinking more, how do I solve this problem? Here is a very specific, unique kind of circumstance, and how do I level the playing field? And that it's such a great story because it's so quintessentially you, right? Like it's very, you are, have always been, in my experience, so very thoughtful about the individual and what the individual needs to be successful. And I feel like it was such a breath of fresh air to me because I came through school and I had a different experience in that I think I came through at a time when things were starting to become very standardized and starting to be based on testing and assessments and stuff
Mhm.
like that. And I think it fundamentally changed the relationship that we have as teacher student. Does that sound true to you, or does that?
Yeah, I think that emphasis on testing and preparing kids for tests has really distorted the opportunities for observation and learning. And when I taught at Denver Public Schools, I have a perfect example of what happens and what can happen. We gave a series of tests, and this was fourth or fifth grade. The long form of it in the fall, the same test. It was criterion reference, the same test in the spring, and a shortened version of it around December. The test results came in, and three of my students who had practically aced the test in the September had scores of about 55% in
Okay.
interim one. And I was supposed to send the test scores with the report card back home to the kids' parents. And I went to my principal and I said, I have three students who scored at the 97th percentile or 97% accuracy
Mm.
in September, and now it says they're at 52% accuracy, and I can't accept those scores. And he said, well, let's send them back and have them rescored. Same results came back. And I just insisted. I said, something's wrong. Somebody needs to take a look at this in the testing center. Well, here's what had happened. These kids were so bright. They were working ahead of the narrative in the test. So they moved past the point where they were supposed to stop and they penciled in a few more answers, and that triggered the scanner to scan the whole test.
Gotcha.
So if they had gotten those test scores, they would have been devastated.
Mm.
And this is what happens with testing sometimes is
Yeah.
there's an element in there. There's all these fail safe measures in place, but sometimes the human interaction trips up
Right.
the process.
Right. And you can't, if you're not paying attention or asking the questions, why is this? It
That's
just
right.
it slides right by. So I want to make sure I understand that. So they were filling out the test and they would fill out additional questions, but
Right,
not all of the questions. So
right.
when it scored, it was scoring for all of the questions.
That's right.
That's so crazy.
Yeah, and so the scoring sheet should have been half blank, and it wasn't.
Right.
So,
Right.
And these kids were just top drawer kids. And so
Right.
that part of the test, I was having to read it aloud because you did that to level the playing field for the kids who weren't good readers.
Right.
So they
Right.
could listen and respond. But these kids, they didn't need to listen to me. They were off and running. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, and at that age, I think you said there was 4th, 5th grade, something
yeah,
like that. I mean, had they gotten those results and had they done so poorly, I mean, that is at such an impressionable age. Like the damage of that could go far beyond just that one moment in time. That's something they carried with them.
that's right. And my granddaughter, who I homeschooled during COVID when she was in kindergarten, she learned to read very quickly. And
Mhm.
she scores very poorly in reading on the iReady test that they use in Colorado.
Mm.
And the first time that happened, the teacher said, "Look, we know she's reading years ahead, so just ignore it." The second teacher wanted to move her into a lower reading group because of the test scores, and of course, my son
Yes.
and daughter-in-law pushed back, and that didn't happen. I personally can't answer main idea questions. I learned when I took my GREs to skip all those because if you don't answer, you lose 1 point. If you get it wrong, you're penalized one and a quarter or something like that. So she probably has something she got from her grandma, which just says, this question makes no sense and I can't quite figure it out. So I'm going to guess, and she gets it wrong, and then it affects her test scores.
Right, and it affects it a quarter of a point more than had she just moved ahead. What do you think the disconnect is that's happening there? Why how do we have this phenomenon of because I'm as you know, I'm very interested in this, of children who read very well, but what happens between that they're obviously cognating and understanding and stuff, but when it gets into the test environment, what do we think is happening there, if we know, that makes it more of a challenge? Is it just that it's such a completely different headspace?
I think it's several things, or one or a combination of things. I think some kids become very anxious
Mm,
in this. Some kids do have an area where there's a gap, like I have, where I just can't
mm,
figure those out. I think for some kids, they just don't care and they don't see the value and they're tested so much. It's just one more routine. My neighbor
mhm.
told me when he was in first or second grade, he was given a standardized test, and this is a very, very brilliant man. And he was told, "You can go outside and play when you're done with the test." So he just went
Ripped through it.
ABC, ABC, so he could go outside and play. So
Yeah.
the the principal called him in, the parents in, and said, "We're gonna have to put him in the special ed class because he has a very low IQ." And, so fortunately, that didn't.
Turns out it was exceptionally high. He knew what he was doing.
He
Yeah.
was a problem solver,
Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
kid. He wanted to go outside and play. So, there are so many things that may or may not be going wrong, but also I think I didn't understand the test making process until I did some work with ETS. And
Mm,
when I had to get in the head of the test maker, I did a better job as figuring out how to be a test taker. And
gotcha.
so I took what I learned from that back into the classroom, and I had my students become test makers and trade papers, analyze how and why their partner responded the way they did, and think about each other's thinking processes. And I think if we did that with kids, gave them a
Mhm.
chance to make a test, come up with a way to try it out on somebody and talk about how it was misinterpreted. Sometimes just missing one word
Yeah.
can cause a total misinterpretation of a question. And
Yeah.
for a fast reader, you know this, we read in chunks.
Right.
We sometimes miss a key word, or we're in such a hurry or in a stressful situation, we're pushing, pushing, pushing. And that one missed word or not checking that there's a comma, which can change
Right.
it,
Right.
where the position is, all those little things. We joke about that sometimes with the punctuation, how it can change the meaning
Right.
totally. But for a child, they're not stopping to parse all those things. They're just moving through it.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So another great illustrative story. I love it. It's funny because it occurs to me as you're saying this that text in and of itself, we don't often realize this, but when you get into it at the level you are, you start to realize that it's kind of a blunt tool. It doesn't, when a little comma or a little misreading of a word can completely change the thing, we start to realize it does as good a job as it can, but it's not like a one-on-one interaction where we're talking to each other and the intent is clear and the meaning is clear. And I think that you did those kids in your class such an amazing service because you were an adult by the time when you got to this realization. You were making tests, right? And you came to this real empathetic way of thinking about it, and how can I make this as clear as possible, and understanding that everybody comes at these things different. That's such a gift that you gave to the children in your classroom because they have learned at a very young age to be mindful of the fact that we all interpret and learn and process differently.
Yeah,
And that's what a great lesson to learn, right? And school, at least when I was in school, didn't really focus on what type of a learner are you, how do you approach learning, and by the way, you probably all come at it a little bit differently. That was never discussed and not something we understood. I think that's much more of a thing now that kids learn about. But you were definitely way ahead of that curve in saying they let them understand at a very deep level what's happening here.
sure. And let them choose their own strategies for organizing their learning too. And that was something that I learned from Phil DeStefano, who went on from a professor position at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I got my doctorate. He went on to become chancellor. He was a gifted, gifted teacher. And he taught a class on strategies where you
Mm,
interpreted text, nonfiction generally, with a different number of strategies. You might do a structured overview where you figure out the overarching theme and then sub themes and subtopics. And I would sometimes teach a variety of these organizational strategies, and then I'd have everybody read a chapter in their social studies or science book, which were, for the most part, deadly dull. But then they would independently figure out how they wanted to restructure the content. So you take something like the environment, a book or a chapter rather on environmental issues. Some children would approach that from the things that they could do independently to improve the environment because that was the underlying concern for them and their personal beliefs. Some would take it from a real global view and they'd start with the world earth, with the word earth, and,
right.
and break it down from there ocean, landforms, things like that, and then go down to a micro level of what affects the oceans, what affects the land, and those kinds of things. So some would do a very top down version starting with the earth, and some would start with trash or
Right.
pollution.
More personal, right.
Right. And so that would come right from their internal. And then they would share those and talk about what motivated you to start this way versus that way. And neither was right or wrong.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. But I love the idea of discussing it though and talking about the strategy because I think it sends the reader to the material with an agenda and with an intent that I can remember as a young reader reading lots of text through my school years, but not really committing to any of it because I had no intent. I had no purpose other than I have to read this to get to the end so I can be done with it, and what are the things I think somebody might ask me on a test
yeah,
later, right? And so the content wasn't soaking in. It wasn't seeping in. I had no intent to it. And I love this idea of, because my kids learned this way, of children understanding how they learn and why they're doing these things. And I think that if they come to things with intent, there's a much higher probability of, cognition and true understanding at an intrinsic level.
Well, let's take reading recipes. I love to
Yes.
browse through cookbooks. I could sit and read cookbooks hour after hour, but am I going to know how to cook after
Mm,
I read those recipes? They might inform me, but until I actually try the recipe out, I'm not going to know if the writer of that recipe did a good job
right.
or if I may need to change it because perhaps the order just didn't work for me, or I could
Right.
multitask. I can be browning the meat while I'm making the pasta. I don't
Right. And you're at high altitude. There might be some adjustments you need to make for that.
right. Well,
Yeah.
there always are. And and then you build knowledge. I was just in Hawaii and I visited the Hawaiian vanilla plantation.
Oh, cool.
And I learned that the flavonoids in vanilla are activated through fat or acid or something else I've forgotten. And all the recipes I've ever used say to put the vanilla in just before you put the dry ingredients in if you're baking. And
Okay.
he said, no, you put the vanilla in at the very beginning because the butter fat, for example, and
Is what releases.
what yeah, activates it. And the more you mix it and let it blend in with it, the more flavor you get out of it. Well,
That's fascinating.
I'm at 77. I've been baking ever since I was a teenager. And I've been doing it wrong because
Right.
just read the recipes.
Right.
And it took going to a vanilla plantation on the big island of Hawaii to learn that now I can do a better way of
Yes.
baking
Yeah.
as I understand the science behind it.
Right. Right. Or you have such a working knowledge of it too. Like I think this is another might touch on another issue, which is that I think when something is written down, we take it as being the ultimate and it's correct and it's fact checked and it's this, and that's gotten us into a lot of trouble with the internet, et cetera. But
Yes.
you know, who questions a recipe? Right? Like you just don't, right? Like it's written down, and so we take it for granted, and we just do it. And I think there's an important message there also of like, if you're not going to have intent and engage and understand what you're reading,
That's
then you're susceptible to just taking it as the one and only, perceived meaning and understanding of that information, and it's not.
yeah, and it doesn't mean that the cookies didn't turn out good.
Right.
They might be just a little better now that I
Right.
know that
Yeah.
strategy. So,
Yeah.
but I've never ever seen a recipe say to put the vanilla in first. And I think this just has a great parallel to reading instruction in general and how we keep adjusting to the science of reading, whatever the science of reading du jour theory
Mhm.
is, which changes regularly. And
Right.
I'm not sure that's right or wrong because I've certainly changed my opinion on reading instruction over the years. But I would go back to one of my early statements that it's always incumbent upon us to think about what our reader is doing when he or she approaches reading, and also to be ready to switch gears and try something
Right.
different if it's not working.
Right. I think that's a really good transition into kind of present tense to say, w- do you have any stories or examples of that? You said over the years, there's been a lot of there's certain themes that kind of come back and forth on science of reading, and you've changed your mind on a couple things. What do you have any examples of kind of something you thought was absolutely one way when you started and now you have a different opinion?
Sure. I think actually I've gone full circle back. So when I was teaching preschool and kindergarten and first grade, I loved using Jeanette Veach's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, where kids would choose an important word, this whole language experience approach. And they would choose an important word. Maybe it's brontosaurus for the day. And so they
Mm,
practice that word and they build on it and they make sentences eventually. It's very time and labor intensive. And I moved away from that more towards the literature based reading in the 80s. And I wouldn't say whole language, although I loved Ken Goodman's work and I've had conversations with him and Yetta Goodman. And I thought a lot of what they had to say was really important and pertinent to reading
mhm,
instruction. But I couldn't quite get all the way because I knew from my son's experience that for some kids, pretty intense phonics instruction was really important and necessary. And there was also a time period, I'm skipping around chronologically a little bit, where when I was teaching in an inner city in Peoria, in predominantly black school, and the SES level was very, very low, almost all free lunch, and very militant time period for
mm,
education at that point. And the big thing was individualized instruction. And I spent so much time with other dedicated teachers on the weekends where we built curriculum, huge boxes and files of individualized work. And I really thought that was the answer at the time. And then in the 80s was more towards the whole language mixed with direct instruction, in part because the school I was at was very invested in the basal reader. So I
mm,
could reorganize the direct instruction to chunk it with their worksheets that they were required to do. And instead of having one page on one topic, maybe main idea, and the next one on a vocabulary discussion, and the next one on um, recalling facts, I would chunk it and we together do a whole bunch of them on main idea. So we really immersed and then we moved on. And then the other strategy I used was giving the end of the unit tests before they took did the unit. And if they could get 80% on the end of unit test, then we skipped all of that instruction and used the literature base. I had classroom sets of books that I had, and I had been teaching children's literature at University of Colorado, Denver. So I had publishers sending me free books all the time. So
right.
I had a huge library in my classroom, thousands and thousands of books, plus classroom sets that my principal let me buy. So I walked the line of using the traditional expected material with shortcuts, and then I
Right.
did what I wanted. And that was immersing kids in the story and using all kinds of strategies for them to show their understanding. Maybe they would do an outline of the chapter they read. Maybe they would write down the old what I know, what I want to know strategies. So we used
Right.
a lot of those literature strategies, sometimes just keeping a journal about what they're reading.
Right.
And then from there, I was moving back towards, for remedial readers, more of the VAKT, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, to really get into what kinds of strategies they needed to imprint some of their learning. So I haven't been in the classroom until COVID, and then I had a kindergarten student where I was doing beginning reading using some of the materials that I had developed for teacher created materials, the phonics kit. And I have to tell you, there were some humbling moments, not with the stories, but with the teacher's guides that I had written. And I thought, what was I thinking? No teacher has time for this activity. I don't
Right.
have time. And I have a
For
kindergarten
one student.
reader. What was
Yeah.
I thinking of? So they've been revising it, and I said I'm very critical of myself, so I will donate my time for the next edition of it. But I felt that that instructional program really was a good blend of having phonics, having strong stories that were engaging,
Mhm.
and that the activities that went along with it made sense. They were
Right.
extensions and ways to ground what they'd been doing. And then in contrast, I had this fifth grader who had not become a reader yet. She
Mm.
read because it was expected, and I was having her. We were reorganizing all the curriculum because we were sneaking little trips in, like to
Right.
Valley Forge in Philadelphia. So I was having her read My Brother Sam is Dead.
Right.
And she never finished it because she found that book so painful. The content, the storyline, everything in it, it didn't resonate with her.
Right.
So, and she knew the outcome. She knew because it's in the title,
Right.
Brother.
And even with the trips, I think that's a good point, right? Like even with the trips, it just still, if it doesn't resonate, it doesn't resonate.
No, so let it go. I mean, how
Yeah.
we as adults, I always felt like I had to finish a book, and I thought, "Why am I doing this?" I have 3 books on my iPad right now that I'll never finish because
Right.
they're just not grabbing me. But along the way, there were some books that we introduced, and now she will not take her head out of a book. She is up until uh, 10 or 11 o'clock at night reading. In fact, I found this coin on the internet that you flip, and one side says, go to sleep now, and the other side says, one more chapter.
I love it. I love it. And do you think that that is mostly to do with she's just finding that content engaging, or has she come to another level kind of with her reading in general, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. I think she listened to me do read alouds all that
Mhm.
year. We found some books that she really did like, and
Right.
then she just got hooked on the fantasy books. I read aloud Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, which I've probably
Okay.
read 10 times.
Yeah.
And that is a fairly easy book to listen to. It has short chapters, lots of cliffhangers, and perfect for that age of fifth grade and kindergarten because they're going to gain different things from this story.
Right.
And she still talks about that was her
Mm.
favorite book. And I think the idea of the fantasy in that, the idea of living forever, there's so much to think about. If you don't
Yeah.
know that book, any reader out there, it's a timeless book. It's short. Again, it's wonderful metaphors in it. It starts out with being on a Ferris wheel as representing the wheel of life. And at
Right. Gotcha.
you get off. You get on, you get off. Or in that case, Tuck Everlasting, the Tuck family could never get off the wheel of life
Mm.
and were stuck. And you find this out in the first chapter that they are
Right.
stuck pretty much in their lives from a variety of reasons. And I think about that when I'm dusting because they never dusted because they had an eternity of dust collecting in their house. Think about that. If
Yeah.
you knew that for eternity, once a week you'd be dusting, dust would be less important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other things we can do besides dust, so just leave it be. So
I love that. I love that. I haven't read that book. I want to now, but mostly because for me, just as a not a thought exercise, but just thinking about what you're saying, that it's working on so many levels. Like what an amazing piece of art that is, that anybody can kind of come to that and take away something appropriate, be it kindergarten, fifth grade, or an adult. That's amazing to me.
yes, and I had many of my fifth graders, because I always read it every year,
Right.
talk about it later throughout the year. And there were some other books. There was one, Goodnight, Mr. Tom, about a World War II setting when children were sent out of London to safety in the countryside. And
Right.
curmudgeonly man takes on this young kid and very reluctantly. It's a long novel. And one year I taught a 3/4 split and I read that book aloud. And then the next year, the kids who came into my fifth grade, who had heard it said, "Please reread Goodnight, Mr. Tom." And I said, "No, there's so many other good books. I want to read other books. I don't want to reread it." I always regretted that because it's such a wonderful book and they wanted to hear it again and they would have gotten even more out of it. And what a mistake on my part that I didn't honor that request to relive that experience of hearing that book again. So, um,
Well, I don't know if it'll make you feel any better, but the chances are probably high that they went back to it on their own or have since shared it with their children.
that's a very good possibility. Yeah,
Yeah.
very good.
So don't beat yourself up
I
too much.
But it was a learning moment for me. You know,
Yeah,
there were other things when I was a teacher that I did, and these were ideas I generally stole from other people, but
right.
um, I would do, a little writing exercise, 2 or 3 times during the year where they would reflect in their journals on the bitter and the best of the last X number of months. And that was humbling too to read that. And one young man who was an excellent student said, I like our class, I like what we do, but I don't like the long range projects because I feel like I can never get done."
Hmm.
And that's when I came to the realization that for some kids, you have to have milestones
Right.
in there so that they feel like they brought closure to a portion of a project. So I redid the research reports and other things accordingly so that there wasn't that feeling of, oh my gosh, for the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be immersed in this one
Right.
horrible project.
Right. Well, and some of us, meaning me, I really relate to that guy because um, I didn't have the self discipline, or, if it happened to be something I was not interested in,
Yeah,
it would just sit there undone and cause stress and anxiety. Whereas I could have had these moments of accomplishment.
right,
You know what I mean?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to call them rescues that
Mm,
I would have to do rescues for these kids so that they would still feel like they learned and accomplished it, and I did a little rescue for them, but it was pretty subtle, and it might just be a checklist
right.
or a rubric. I loved rubrics because
Yeah.
it gave such a wonderful framework of understanding for the kids, and I used those when I taught grad school too. That was a process.
But I love the nomenclature of a rescue rather than a rubric.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? That like kind of speaks to me as like as a kid I would have been, or even as an adult. I love the, it's so personal and helpful and, saving, whereas a rubric is so, for me, dry and
yeah.
stiff and not personal and,
And it's
fighting it.
external. A
Yes.
rescue, you can sit down and say, "Okay, I've noticed we're having a problem with this. What can we do?
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
figure it out." Sometimes they come up with better answers once they're given the agency to do
Sure.
that. And I
Yeah.
think with reading in particular, if you have choice involved and you can choose to reread a book and it's accepted and celebrated, then I think that carries a kid a long way. It's validating that they
Yeah.
have preferences and that they will be honored for what they do. We we were in Ireland a year ago with these two that I taught. Of course, they're
Mm.
older now. They were a couple years older at this point, and Ivana, the older one, hadn't brought enough books with her, and
Uh-oh.
we were walking around in Galway or one of these small towns in Ireland looking for a bookstore that had uh, books in English and
Right.
a variety of language. Actually, it was a really big bookstore, and she found the series that she was immersed in and was thrilled. And I think that will always stick with her that we're walking along a little town in Ireland and she walks into this bookstore and there's this book series. So that universality of literature
Yeah.
around the world, um, That's just mind blowing to me. We were really celebrating that, and it carried her through the next portion of the
Yeah.
school.
Yeah, no, I think that it's funny when we think about the written word and the printing press and all, all these stuff, so these things that we think about kind of more academically now, but like it's funny once in a while I think back, I do a lot of thinking about like, okay, where did this come from and why do we do things this
Mhm.
way and how was it before? So I think a lot about these times before there was printing press and universality and translated texts and all of these things and how much, I don't want to say worse because it's not a positive negative thing, but just what a different place humankind was in because of that. We were so insular from one another or separated from one another that I just think as the human race, it just, held us back. And then once there was this great kind of world of literature and text and knowledge and the ability to share, uh, it really changes everything. And that's what really drives kind of my passion for, like, everybody needs to have access. Everybody needs to be able to get their hands on this knowledge, information, story, whatever it happens to be. It's just such an amazing world that's represented there.
Well, you're absolutely right, and if you think of the history of the reading world, and I know you do because we've talked about this, reading was kept away from
Right.
underprivileged people. So
Yeah.
privileged people could read the Bible and read aloud to others, and or chorals, choirs. They had
Mm.
the great big books that maybe they shared, and
They all had to, yeah, gather around.
right, and those pages were precious. I have one of those on my wall that's in Catalan from the late 1400s,
That's cool.
and it is precious to me because of the history that it
Yeah.
represents from when only a privileged few were even allowed to look at it and
Right.
the music on it. And then we went to the churches in large
Right.
part being used to help with
Yeah.
reading with their responsive readings. So you're reading these passages from the Bible, and that
Yep.
was very deliberate to make it more egalitarian and be able to spread that skill, but it was still a very narrow skill.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And most of the masses got, it's funny, like, when you go to those churches, especially throughout Europe and stuff that are from that time, and you see these big, beautiful, amazing stained glass windows, which are there to awe, but they're also to convey the Bible stories
that's right.
to a world of people who could not read, who were not afforded the opportunity to read.
Right. You have the pictorials that go
Right.
along with it, with the written word. And then, as you've discussed with the advent of the assembly line with Ford
Mm.
and figuring that everybody can learn to read if we just break it all down into little teachable parts and we'll hit everybody. And there came Dick Jane, and that's what I grew up on. And I remember
Yep.
thinking in reading class, because I was one of those that just got it, um, being so bored and waiting for the round robin reading was just so excruciatingly painful. But
Yeah.
I'll tell you, in fifth grade one year, I had said, "Look, I'll take all the best readers and all the worst readers. If I'll take the worst if I can have the best." And
Right.
year that
And you were teaching fifth grade.
yeah, I was teaching fifth
Okay.
grade. And we
Gotcha.
had three classes, and we were reorganizing the kids. And I said, "I know remedial reading. I'll take on these kids, but I also want the top." So I could choose stories that the kids would sign up. I put a
Right.
synopsis on the board, and then they'd go out and sign up. So sometimes the groups were mixed with very struggling readers. But I also had the Robert Newton Peck series Soup, and all of my low readers, mostly boys, mostly brown and black skin, not all, but mostly, wanted to
Hmm.
read the Soup,
Yeah.
which starts out very low, starts out second grade, and these were fifth
Yep.
graders. And we did the old-fashioned round robin reading, and I would have them sit in a circle on the floor, and we'd go around, and then after about one quick turn each, I'd read aloud the rest of that chapter because I couldn't stand to listen to them read aloud anymore. Okay, guilty confession.
Yes.
But one day, one of the kids read with expression. And I said, wow, that was great expression. And guess what? They all were starting to read with expression to one up the other one.
The other ones, yeah. It got competitive.
My,
Imagine that.
my principal walked in and he was great. He always walked through and checked up with
Yes.
everybody every day, and he would stop and listen sometimes or just watch. And he sat down in a chair listening to these, kids with some of them lousy reputations
Right.
in the neighborhood. And there they were reading with expression. And
Giving Shakespearean soup
it
performances.
was amazing,
That's
amazing.
so cool.
And then they wanted to read the next one in the series.
Yeah.
Finally, it was towards the end of the year. There was one more book in the series, and it was sixth grade reading level. And they had actually independently read the blurb on the back of the book about the series and begged me to order the sixth grade collection. So I asked my principal, and he said, oh, absolutely, I'll buy those for you. They came just before PE. I opened the box. I said, look what came. They said, can we skip PE so we can read? Success.
That's the highest compliment you could get, right?
No, it was just so amazing. I didn't let them skip PE because I needed
No,
to
of
be able to
course
run to the bathroom and
not.
make a phone call, all that. But that's what you want. You
Yeah.
really doesn't matter what it is and where you start. You just have to get that hook.
Get the spark going.
Yeah, and give
Yeah.
them what they need. And if it's round robin reading, which I hated and is frowned upon now, I don't care. It
Yeah.
just might work.
Yeah. Well, this is the hard part of current times, right? Like,
Right,
I understand why it's frowned upon because, right, you don't want to single people out and highlight them and have give them that anxiety and all that stuff. But the other side of that coin is that expression that you're talking about and that being able to model off of others. And I think sometimes we're just a little too afraid to give people the exposure they need to be able to model the right way to do it or to at least have exposure to it.
right. And it was sort of accidental. I had never prompted it, but they
Sure.
did it on their own. And we didn't do in the for the next series, we didn't do round robin. We did a different strategy. And
Hmm.
one of the strategies I would use harkens back to the test taking. I would ask them to write for the chapter 3 test questions.
Right.
And then we would share those in a discussion group. So it was very informal, but it was some level of accountability.
Right, right. That I forgot to go back on this, but you had said something earlier that made me really perk up, and I thought, God, I wish I had a teacher that had done this. Is that when you said I would give them the test for the chapter before they even read it, and if they were able to perform well on it, you could just move on. And I thought, what a brilliant thing that is, because it's a win-win. Either so A, you get to know exactly what their level is,
Right,
but B, like if it's me and I'm the student and I now know what the questions are going to be at the end of it, like that takes so much pressure off of me. Like
right,
it just either way, either we're skipping it or I have kind of the answer key, right? Not
right.
really, but sort of.
Or I have the skills. I have the skills.
Right.
I know I can do this. So
Yeah.
why do I need to practice it if
Yeah.
my mastery is there?
Right.
And there's so many ways to learn. And I think when we get into the artificial intelligence part of this, knowing what you can skip can be
Mhm.
accomplished with that.
Right.
Shaping the material accordingly. I I just got a pachinko machine given to me. This seems pretty random, but I had it delivered after getting it renovated. I had somebody pick it up for me and bring it. So I didn't know the steps that I needed to take. with
Right.
the machine once I had it. And it turned out I needed a special tool to open the front door. So I had to wait for Amazon to deliver an extra long, thin needle nose pliers.
Mm,
So what did I do? I got on YouTube and started looking
yeah.
for videos on how to set up and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I also waited for the guy who did the renovation to call me and walk me through the steps.
Right.
But I
Right.
pretty much knew what to do, and that was
Yeah.
because there was a resource there.
Right.
And I've also had great experiences with assembling things because I live alone and I don't want to pay somebody. When I get these assembly instructions that are all arrows
Yeah.
and
Pictograph.
pictures, I
Yeah.
at first was just horrified by that. I thought I need a narrative. I can't do this.
Right.
Well, after the first time where I just really studied those diagrams, I thought, this is a brilliant person that put this together. I get it. I can do
Mm-hmm.
this myself. It's so simple. I don't have to reread the
Right.
instructions. And aren't we lucky to be in a time where content can be delivered in a variety of forms
Yeah.
and be useful?
Yeah, yeah, and it kind of allays that anxiety, right? And we talked about this when we were doing the YouTube Kids stuff, like how to, at least give like it's almost like a pre-experience of something. Because I do the same thing all the time, even if it's something I know how to do. I'll go on YouTube, and I'll be like, okay, I have to change this pipe out or whatever, and I know kind of, intuitively what I need to do. But seeing someone else do it and walk through. And it's also a different kind of engaged viewing, or just as it is engaged reading if you're looking at the instructions or whatever. And it just takes some of that anxiety out of it. And as you know, I'm a big believer that if we can use technology to take some of those negative feelings and nervousness out of things, then we definitely should be doing it.
Well, and it also that triggered a thought is that I like I'm sure many people do when I'm looking at a video, I can advance it,
Right.
I can pause it, I can move it back and
Yeah.
look at something repeatedly. I can
Right.
customize that learning experience, that instructional piece to my needs because
Right.
some things I don't need,
Right.
but some things I need to really study it or stop and look at whatever I'm trying to do. Or like right now, I'm trying to install a, a towel holder in my bathroom wall, and I've totally bungled it because I went by memory for how
Right.
to put an anchor in a wall, and I should have looked it up to refresh my memory.
Yeah.
And we can do that now with all these videos and instructional things, but sometimes I revert back to the written word. I just want to read it real quickly. I just want a
Yeah.
quick overview and move on because it's just a refresher that I need.
Right.
And
Right.
I can read fast, so I don't want to sit and watch a video because I can read
Right.
fast.
No, that makes sense.
Tell me.
But you are self-governing, you're in control, you have the agency, you're moving through it at the speed that is right for you. And I think that's the biggest point there. I should admit, however, there are plenty of times that I watch the video and read the instructions and I still manage to do it completely wrong. I don't know how that happens, but I think it's probably some male overconfidence going in.
Well, that keeps other people employed when we do.
Exactly.
So, so there's some benefits to that too.
Yeah, no, exactly. Then, but by the second, third, sometimes fourth time around, I get it right. So I guess there's a iteration happening. All right, so we're just about an hour. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you about before we run out of time here was, um, it occurred to me that you have three big kind of topical loves in your life. Like you have a lot of loves in your life with people, but you have music, you have teaching, and you have travel, right?
Right.
Something that and you may have others, but these are the ones that anybody who sees your posts on Facebook or anybody who knows you even a little bit knows that these are your big passions. And I wonder if you feel like these things are somehow related or have a similarity to them, or maybe they're disparate from one another and therein lies the attraction. But have you ever thought about your passions and how they drive you?
Well, you left out what I would say would be a fourth, and that would be writing.
And right, yes.
Yeah, because I do have 300 books in print and
Yes.
um,
Oof.
with a variety of publishers.
That's amazing, by the way.
Uh,
300
well, some
books.
of those
That's
were real short.
yeah, but still that's
Yeah,
300 projects.
yeah, and that that is something I don't do as much anymore.
Mhm.
The long projects, I just don't want to. I don't want to work that
Right.
hard. I'm getting too old. But I think each one has roots in my history. My parents loved to travel, and we would do car trips. Even though we, didn't have very many financial resources, travel was a priority.
Right.
Sometimes I just got out of the car and stepped over the border and said, "Okay, I can check Maine off my
Did that,
list,"
right.
and then headed south. Um, and they had me my souvenirs, they had me collect dirt samples, and it wasn't till I was 70 that I thought, "Wow, those they were cheapskates." I had little pill bottles collecting dirt samples all over the United States while my friends were getting, key chains or something that
You know
cost.
what's so funny is when you said that, my brain went to, wow, that's amazing. Because how else would the dirt from Maine be in wherever you were? You know what I mean? Like, to me, I was like immediately distracted by this. That dirt shouldn't be there.
Yeah,
And how cool is it that all these different dirts are there together and they shouldn't be?
I had this huge collection of vials of dirt samples from every one of the continental states by the time I was 16. But we also had music lessons,
Mm.
and so
Did your parents play music?
my mother was a fine singer and
Mm.
pianist and could play by ear and taught herself the organ. And so
Wow.
she directed the church choir because back then that's what the preacher's wife did if she had
Sure.
the ability to do that. So the travel and the music were just a part of my life from
Hmm.
the time I was um, little. And then, of
Yeah.
course, the teaching just came about again, the role model of my mother, who was a wonderful teacher. My first publication was actually a little essay I wrote in college about an experience that my mother had with me. I was home from school and I she was talking about her students. She taught in a very poor area. And I said, "Mom, you're not supposed to get emotionally involved." Of course, what did I know? I was a
Right.
junior in college. So she said to me, I'm going to bring Tina home for lunch when you're home on Christmas vacation." And my neighbor was a beautician. So I'd actually been taught some beautician school or tools
Yeah.
and skills
Nice.
and did a lot of hair cutting through college. And so she said, "Would you give her hair a little trim? And I'm going to fix pizza for her." And mom,
Right.
we lived very close to the school where mom was teaching. So she brings her home and she has some little things from Santa, a whole new outfit, and it's under the tree. And so here's this little waif with a brand new outfit on. I've washed and fixed her hair. We've had pizza. And as my mom and Tina left to go back to school, my mom looks at me very archly, says, "Do you still think you shouldn't get emotionally involved?"
Oh,
And she got me. I went back to college and we were supposed to write about something in a class, and I wrote about that.
hmm.
And Professor Zabka read it aloud to my humiliation to the whole class.
Well,
And,
at least you didn't have to round robin read it.
right. And,
Yeah.
and then he said, "May I photocopy that to use in my other and future classes?"
Wow.
And it wasn't until years later I thought I was actually published while I was in college
Yeah.
in a very small way.
Right.
But that was one of those things that just came from the heart.
Yeah.
And so I still write when I'm really moved, when something
Mhm.
grabs me and I just feel like I have to get it out.
Yeah. I met when we were at Leapfrog together, we were talking about doing, television, and of course, that ended up being videos. But we had met, a gentleman by the name of Peter Guber, who, ran Sony Studios at one point, and he came in to kind of advise. And I remember, and I'll never forget this. I remember him talking about stories and talking about entertainment and describing all of this that we do as emotional transportation.
Ah, ah,
And I thought, what a brilliant way to think about it. And it makes sense to me. It's what I thought of immediately when you said, you need to be moved, or your best writing happens when you're moved by something. And I think that it's part of that, right? Like, you want to take people on that journey with you.
right. Or you just need to get it out.
Yeah.
And writing for me is sometimes a way of just expressing, and then I can set it aside. It's done.
Yeah. 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 It kind of wraps it all up.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. And I have the most respect for you. I think you're incredibly talented.
Well,
I
like,
love this insight from your fan. I, sorry. Give me one sec. What's up? Nah, I wouldn't worry about it. Okay. Sorry about that. Um, what I was going to say is I love having this insight from your family and what great people they are and how they've obviously had an impact on you throughout your whole career and your life and everything.
I think about that so much as we age and we hear the stories of other people in their lives, and
Right.
I sometimes marvel at how lucky was I.
Yeah.
My playground was a junkyard, the Illinois River, factories. I
Yeah.
was surrounded by factories and cornfields,
Yeah.
and 2 blocks away from 4 factories. That
Yeah.
probably that's why my lungs are so horrible. But it was the kind of life where you could go play in the junkyard and not
Yeah.
garbage, junk. I mean, cool,
Right. Right.
like an army
Yeah.
truck, things like that. And then my parents made sure I got to music lessons, and I think back about that, driving us all the time to rehearsals and school and never missed a competition, a band competition,
Right.
the piano recitals, all of that stuff. I mean, that
Right.
takes such dedication. And
It's funny because in all the examples you gave me, there's an interesting mix of being super involved, but also letting you be independent.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
And I think that that's a really important thing to talk about in today's day and age, right? I think there's not a lot of clarity that comes down to new parents on, you know, we have helicopter parents and then we have parents that are not involved at all, but it's that mix of both, right? That makes you feel safe enough to be super independent.
I would get on the city bus, which fortunately stopped right in front of my house.
Yeah.
I could stand inside and see it come around the corner and get out in time. But for a nickel, I could take the bus and I'd go to the down library and I
Yeah.
could check out my 7 or 10 books that I was allowed, bring them home, read them all, or go to the Five and Dime or go to the movie. It was a small town of 20,000 people.
Mhm.
Back in the 50s, you could do stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when I travel with my granddaughters, I make them figure out where we are and how we're going to get from point A to point B. I've done it
Right.
with all the grandkids, starting from the time we get to the airport. You tell me where our gate is. Go to the
Yeah.
board, figure it out, read it, and tell me what we're going to do. And it pays off. My 19-year-old grandson was in Israel when the war broke out and
Mhm.
texting me, and I was coaching him
Wow.
find a flight out of Tel Aviv to Istanbul, get to
Right.
Istanbul, and then you can get back into the EU.
Yeah.
And he was on his way within 72 hours. And
It's amazing.
think it was because he'd had to be independent.
Yeah.
when I traveled with him.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was a safety net, but
Yeah.
he picked up some valuable skills about problem solving, persistence. Just
Yeah.
get on that phone and keep working it. Work
Yeah.
the internet until you find a way to.
And be self-reliant, right? And I think that this is one of the things I'm sure you see these things all the time too, but when I see educational apps or materials or television programming, whatever it happens to be that's aimed at children, and it jumps right out at me, the people that have no respect for their audience. And that sounds harsh, but what I really mean by that is they don't trust or entrust the children enough with bigger topics or being self reliant or understanding that if you give children situations, they can figure it out. They're much smarter than people think. And I think we've lost a little bit of that because I think a lot of the entertainment and materials that are targeted at children these days don't have a healthy enough respect for the intelligence of children.
I agree, and I think too, we're so reluctant, I think that particularly your middle class and upper middle class parents, so reluctant to let the children take risks for good
Right.
reason in many cases, depending
Yeah.
on where you live, and then
But you've kind of overcorrected.
right, and then we
Yeah.
also we don't want them to feel the burdens that we had as children,
Right.
not realizing that giving them those skills, having them help you set the table, having
Mhm.
them cut up the vegetables. Yeah, they might prick their finger or do something like that.
Sure.
Band-Aid usually fixes those things. And yes, it takes longer, and yes, it's messy, and kids drop things and they break things, and oh, too bad. You clean it up and you keep going.
Yeah.
And you don't make a big deal out of it. And those
Right.
kids are the ones that, when they get off to college, know how to do something other than pop popcorn.
Right, exactly. Because you have to fail to iterate and you have to get hurt to learn the right way of doing things. You know what I mean? And it's kind of I think that it's funny because I've worked at Spotify and Google and all these places. I've worked with a lot of millennials and my peers will often say, as we all hear, oh, millennials don't do this and this generation doesn't do that and they never learned how to do this. And I always say, well, whose fault is that?
Yeah, right,
Really, it's not their fault, clearly, because they're children.
right.
It's Gen X's fault. I always say, it's our fault because we were the generation of instant gratification. And so when I had children, I wanted them to have success always. I never wanted them to fail. When they wanted to be in a band, I didn't make them toil away in the garage. I signed them up for rock and roll fantasy camp so that they can be on stage for their very first performance. And,
Right.
that's our fault. We did that,
Yeah,
you know? And we have to take responsibility for that. We have to understand, like, just trust them. This is how we learn as a species by failing.
that's right. And I think we also went through that period of time where we didn't want their little precious psyches to be hurt. And so
Yeah.
we wanted them all to feel special and we wanted
Yep.
them all to get participation awards. And I remember when my I asked my mom when I was real little, this was a seminal moment. I was probably 4 or 5, and I was just understanding the concept of being pretty.
Right.
And I asked my mom, Mom, do you think I'm pretty? Or am I pretty? That's what I asked.
Right.
Am I pretty? And she said, Well, I think you are. And I thought, Oh, well, I must not be. I mean, I'm
Right.
smart enough to read between the lines. It's just my mom who thinks I'm pretty that
Yeah.
not. So that just stuck with me as a perfect example of how
Yeah.
kids see through it. And if you're
Oh, totally.
thinking, "Oh, you're so smart, you're so beautiful, you're so
Yeah.
clever," and you say that over and over, it's like, it's noise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you
I
need
mean, it's the same like you're talking about the participation awards. Like my boys knew enough as kids. Like they don't care about those trophies. They don't like who are we really doing this for?
right, right.
You know?
Or
Yeah.
making sure everybody gets an award. Well, in the first
Yeah.
place, why are you even doing those end of the year awards? So,
Right.
I
Right.
was never big on that kind of stuff. but recognition along the way,
Yes. Notorious.
that
Yeah.
made something special for the
Yes.
kids. And it doesn't
Yes.
have to be a badge, it doesn't have to be a sticker. Although I have to tell you, when my kids became really good writers of poetry, somebody asked me who was observing, they said, how did you get the kids to do this? To be so good and to be so open
Yeah.
and stand up and share and read aloud their poems or their essays. How did you do that? And I said, that's a good question. I don't know. I can't remember how I really got them so good.
Right.
So I asked the kids, how did I do that? Because you're also good at this. I mean,
Yeah.
even the really poor writers were
Right.
good at sharing. And they said, well, you bribed us. And I said, what? I didn't, but don't you remember you had stickers? And I thought, oh, that's right. I did. But it went from that extrinsic to the intrinsic over.
Hmm.
And so I did bribe the kids with stickers to
Right.
start, but it didn't take long that stickers weren't necessary because they
Right.
realized the value of their accomplishments through group approbation and group
Right.
sharing and everything. So I think, especially as kids get into those middle school years when they just feel like they can't do anything right and they don't know who they are and what they're going to
Yeah.
do, and there's all these pressures, and I talk a lot about that with my
Hmm.
grandkids and with my grown sons, because I'm trying to understand, how bad was it when you were in junior high, and is this something that kids just have to endure,
Hmm.
or can we compartmentalize so they can get through the day and get on to other things?
Yeah.
It's a problem.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard. It's adult training, and I think all kids go through it in different ways.
Mhm.
Right? Like we all had struggles during those years, and they were all different, whether you're smart or pretty, or because nobody can be all of everything to
That's
everyone,
that's
right? So everybody has shortcomings,
right.
and that gets missed, I think, because we don't talk about it.
I think you're right, and I think this all goes back to reading as such an important basic skill. If you can turn kids into readers, give them the skill so that they can navigate the world, solve the
Right.
problems they encounter, it's such a gift.
Yeah, definitely, because it's giving them experiences that they didn't have to go through themselves,
Right.
right? And yeah, no, I think it's so important. It's the biggest gift we could give is the gift of reading. So, um, okay, I have gone way over time, but I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I feel like at this moment, I feel like we should have a conversation of this depth and length every week because I just always find it so fascinating.
I
But
think I gave you most of my good stories, though, so
yeah, I guess we'd probably run out after a while. But it was, thank you for giving me these great stories.
yeah,
I really enjoyed it. Thank you,
my
Suzanne.
pleasure.